So the user is equipped with a medical, professional quality EEG cap. We'll see which electrodes and which mechanism we're using. He's watching the generated narrative from inside a system that's projected through a mirror. He's outside the MRI scanner at the moment, and he's receiving instructions at the beginning of the session, and during the active neurofeedback phases, the scanning machine will take slides with one. Will take cuts, virtual ones, whose goal is to validate that the neural mechanisms are actually those that we were trying to activate. So it makes the interface fairly larger than the computer system.
Yeah.
And this is how it works. So watching there, the experiment lasts 40 minutes, and out of well, I took it with other subjects, so that I would not just look on the outside. I think it's fun, but not everybody enjoys staying 40 minutes in a noisy MRI scanner, which is also fairly cold because there's liquid helium cooling. This is why the guy had a blanket. Subject watching. The story in that case is complete. It's the same story, same baseline, but we've modified it to really request explicit support, explicit empathy from the user. So it's the same story, except that the default progression is always towards the demise of the nice character. And the way it works is that it privileges at early stage of the search the negative actions, like the harassment or the workload or the threats of redundancy. Once a certain stage of difficulty is reached, the character appears really miserable, and that creates a neurofeedback session. She's actually fading to grey, and you can restore her natural appearance by the BCI mechanisms, which I'm going to describe. That, of course, feeds back into the story. The story can change if the subject has properly supported the character, and to make sure that it is actually the right mechanisms which is in operation, we're taking these scans during the neurofeedback session. The BCI model and the neurofeedback paradigm is something which is called prefrontal alpha asymmetry. Why is this? Imagine that you want to get... We never know what we're doing with affective categories, which is why so many people move to dimensional models. What would be really nice is to move to some form of high-level affective model for which there is still a neural correlate and possibly a reasonable clinical correlate. It is the case that the asymmetry between the level of alpha waves in the prefrontal cortex is an indicator of approach and avoidance, which is a kind of primitive, pre-Ekmanian dimension. It's also very well correlated to mood and depression. And like many alpha waves, it can also be an object of neurofeedback. The guy the scientist who discovered that is called Davidson. He has a lot of paper on prefrontal alpha asymmetry, including the use of neurofeedback on that model to improve mood and to alter your mood baseline. So I've read things very interesting, like they will normally change the personality of the subject, which is why our training sessions are 2 minutes and they're not 3 weeks, because well, there are things which are not part of the core research we should not explore at the moment. You can get prefrontal asymmetry very easily through F3 and F4, but of course you need to put it into a neurofeedback paradigm. So what is prompting these supporting actions where essentially she asks for your help are these types of situations which are strongly dramatic. The boss applying work pressure, she's struggling with paperwork, you've seen her being harassed by a colleague, and of course she can lose patience. And in all these cases, she is getting fairly miserable. So the neurofeedback signal is her appearance. She's fading to grey, and when she really needs your help, She looks miserable, she fades to grey, and this is where you have to support her. And you're just told to support her. And this is one of the keys of the experiment, because if you tell people, if you give too specific instructions, you are going to bias towards an activation of certain areas. If you say, cheer her up, tell her something mentally, then the language areas will be flaring. So we wanted to give the most basic instruction, leaving to the subjects themselves to implement the strategy. So we told them you were equipped with, brainwave sensor. When she'll be in trouble, you have the power to help her. To help her, you have to think about her, think positively about her, be positive, be supportive, and you'll see that working. And of course, if they manage to get alpha symmetry, they immediately get the feedback, and of course that reinforced the right thing they are doing. At debriefing, we got fantastic responses. So there were people who were actually, having inner cheers. So we saw slight burst of language activation, but they were still compatible with frontal activation. We had someone who said, I thought about my girlfriend. So you could imagine what had happened if thinking about his girlfriend had failed in the neurofeedback task. He would have left the scanner with a new piece of information. They are very creative for the strategies. I'm only talking about a successful subject. We only had 50% successful subjects, which is quite good because between 2 and 5 minutes of training outside the scanner versus 3 weeks training in Davidson experiment, and we still have 50% of subjects who were able to activate the neurofeedback mechanism. It works, it looks like that. So this is what the subject is seeing from inside. This is the story as it sees inside the MRI machine. This is what we see from the control room, and keeping an eye on the subject. The experiments are subtraction experiments. So what happens? The EEG will not be affected because you're in F3 and F4, won't be affected by motion. Subjects are strapped, they're asked to stay still, but people are more or less compliant after 40 minutes. But in any case, the scans are differential scans between the active phase and a passive replay of the animation. So parasite motion can be filtered out. So example in the form of a vignette comic strip. You start by an action which is negative towards the featured character, since by default that the situation will be bad for her. So here it's sexual harassment, and here it's a plot to steal her case, to steal her patient. Once a certain level of difficulty is built up, you can imagine that after sexual harassment you're in trouble immediately, while after some more built up difficulties, the request for support would come later. But the system always forces request for support to be on the first third of the story. So here you have successful support, and you see a positive evolution of the case. The user is always given 2 opportunities for support. In some cases, the first one failed, the second one succeeded. Actually, in the vast majority of these 6 cases, both opportunities were successful. And if it doesn't work, or if you don't want to support her, because we told people, this is where a debriefing was needed as well. They were those saying, I did my best, I really cheated her, I wanted to support her, but I couldn't. And others say, no, I wanted to see what happened. I did nothing. I didn't have any thoughts that were specifically happy or positive. I just thought, well, why is she getting herself in that situation? I was very, very indifferent. And of course, it evolves into a negative situation with still some variation. So when we're saying that the baseline plot is the demise of the character, it's not one single story. It would be a bad ending, but there are several different stories with a bad ending. A representation of our actual implementation. So this is still plan-based. And our planner used a declarative level of control with landmarks, which is something which has been developed by Julie Porteous, who since has joined our group. The idea is that you discretize the level of support that you're getting from your feedback, depending on the threshold, and you use a number of fluents, and depending on that, you'll be fitting that back in the planner. So you see here what happens in terms of both the support and whether the need for support and whether support is successful. And if it's not the case, of course, it's evolving towards the nice doctor's demise. And if it's successful, then skipping here the details of the story, there is a happy ending. Now, so back to the neuroscience. We need to check. The main problem with BCI is that you never know what happens. So you could tell people to wear, an EEG and do something else. You're never sure that the mechanisms that are activated, people think are activated, are the correct ones. One very simple example. People have been trying to sell dry electrodes. Certain dry electrodes on the very cheapest systems are actually measuring muscular activation. So you're back to measuring frowning. You're absolutely not doing BCI whatsoever. But people want to think so hard that this is BCI, that it does the job, and you can still sell a very cheap BCI device. Actually, there's one of the former contestants from The Apprentice that has a startup company selling BCI for film. And people just say that it's magic, it's BCI. So, because we say we want to implement the Davidsonian paradigm, we think that frontal alpha symmetry in the medial prefrontal cortex, which is the area which deals with control and regulation of emotion, what has really been activated? What's happening in the brain? This is what you see here on 4 of the 6 subjects. And this is again subtraction. Subtraction from. This is not the EEG. This is the bold signal, which is the brain oxygen level, which is used for generating the MRI image. This is the active version, and these highlighted areas are the neurofeedback area, where subjects are asked to think positively. You see that in both cases, and this is the bold signal in prefrontal areas. So in all successful subjects, you have a peak in the regions you really wanted to activate, and you see it in the average, with only one contralateral version, but it's still an asymmetry in the prefrontal cortex. More interesting, and something for which we don't have an explanation, this is passive replay. You're showing the video again in the MR machine, taking more scans, and telling the subject, well, this time there's no point, being supportive. You'll be just watching the video and relax. You see a dip in activation, and again, this is the fMRI signal. This is not the EEG signal. A specific dip in the activation during those events which corresponded to the neurofeedback point. If we magnify these, we see that there's a great diversity across subject. These are human subject. This is biology. It's not like there's one magic area with a switch or a switchboard, which is emotion control. All we know is that it's prefrontal cortex, and we must also admit that the individual specification of the support mechanism, which is different across individuals, plays a role in the difference of pattern, as well as just the quality of the subject, or his ability, or her ability to engage in neurofeedback, and to which extent they can activate their area. If we average over the subject, so we're considering now the subject as a group, and we're trying to average the signal. That gets really interesting, because on the positive phases, the difference in activation of the prefrontal cortex between the support phase and the passive phase is really significant. So whatever we have done is more or less consistent. We say that, Davidson say that Prefrontal alpha symmetry is a mechanism for empathy. It can be subject to neurofeedback. We observe such neurofeedback on the alpha symmetry of F3 and F4, and when we scan, we saw the same regions being activated. Some people say, yes, but, you know, mirror neurons, empathy, mirror neurons. Motor areas. It could well be that the motor areas are activated and has nothing to do with Davidson models. If you look at the difference between successful and unsuccessful subject in the motor cortex, the difference is not statistically significant. If you look at a difference in the medial prefrontal cortex, which is not the motor cortex, but it's the cortex we're targeting, the area we're targeting, that is significant. So, with all the caveats of, you know, there's a paper recently which showed that 80% of all neuroscience experiments are basically wrong. So with a pinch of salt, we can at least say that it's not very plausible that the motor cortex is the alternative explanation to our observed phenomena. If we look to the more detailed activation on some subject, we still see that there is a temporal region which seems to be activated consistently across subject. That temporal area is related to semantics. So obviously there's an element of scene interpretation, but in some, as per the debriefing feedback, there are some elements of inner cheering and use of language as part of the neurofeedback. Very well localized and very consistent. Colors, different subjects. So you see all three subjects really exhibit a consistent pattern, and I am the green one. So, and I don't know why I'm doing these other things. And I was told that perhaps I was really excited about the experiment myself because I had a kind of vested interest in it succeeding. So maybe this is the next paper area which is flashing. Now, if we summarize the activation, so in this video we are plotting the actual evolution of the story in terms of a brain region activation. So of course, you know, red is hot and blue is cool. Blue means less activation and red means more activation. And what you're going to see here is the story as seen by the subject, the alpha symmetry score, which is essentially RBCI, and a plot of the bold signals, the fMRI signals, on an anatomical model of the brain. So what is interesting is to see that the A2 asymmetry score is fairly, you know, noisy. You also get the music now. So you get the scene, and you can imagine that she'll be in trouble and asking for help, which is going to arrive pretty soon. So this is what the subject sees, and it's been briefed that it needed to be positive at this time. Now look, after the onset, this is a successful subject, of course. Up, you have a peak in the symmetry score, and you see she's regaining color. But you have to sustain her. You can just have one spike, and it's enough. That signals that the neurofeedback is about to, the opportunity is about to conclude. And you see the red areas were temporal and prefrontal cortex. That also gives an idea of the length, you know, of some of the generated narratives. You have another neurofeedback opportunity. Although the first one being successful, you know, the story would progress. We had different types of findings. We had some subjects who, you know, were happy to succeed the first time, so didn't try as hard the second time. We have very good subjects who really were good at that, and they had fantastic scores on both tries. But you still see that on average during the neurofeedback phases, although it's not consistent, you have this average elevation. So now we know she's saved, because she received positive support. the way it's actually implemented in the system, you can't hear anything even with headsets, with the noise of the scanning machine. So we carried out the experiment in Tel Aviv. So we had subtitles in Hebrew, not to try any chances with second language abilities, and this is how it operates. So you see the type of activation I'm referring to. We couldn't give up completely on the Smithian cues. So this is another realization of one of the excerpt you've seen before. So he caused the problem by messing up with the protocol. Now he's very anxious about what's going to happen in the OR where they're trying to save her. But he's even more worried if he thinks that the problems can be traced back to him. The team, so some of you have known or have met some of our team, and the team at Tel Aviv is the team of Professor Thelma Hendler. And in her neuroscience department, she also had the film graduates and people going for PhDs in film studies, and they've been quite active, as you've seen on their work on empathy in the neural basis of affect. So that concludes my presentation. Just a quick announcement. I'm organizing the INT6 workshop. You know, I mean, we all have to do that at some time. So within that, there's a panel which is on PDA representations of narrative. So the idea is that you're giving a narrative which is one known to everyone but not anyone already modeled and published by a specific team. You're asked to produce between 20 and 40 PDL operators and to come to AID and INT6 to the panel to talk about, and there's nothing to win, it's just about something very simple. We've been writing lots of these when we know that some of our models are really not good and we struggle with that. I think probably people would be motivated if they saw that everybody's struggling, and maybe people could exchange anything from worst practice to hope. I think it's something worth doing. I'll only run the panel if there's sufficient interest. I already have some interest emerging, but I thought that call for this could be also the right place for a call for interest.
First question is, who did your music? Because music is like Hitchcock style film, yeah?
Yeah, well, we had lots of discussions on music, which hinge from classical music and Hitchcock style music, and then asking advice here and there. It appears that the interpretation of classical music is really extremely cultural, if not personal. Some people think that some pieces of Sibelius are extremely threatening, and others see that from the Finnish historical perspective of the revolution. So we went for really the low-hanging fruit, things that sometimes were excerpts of existing soundtracks and were kind of consensual, and of course by definition, if consensual, not very original in sending the message about the climate of a particular scene.
So do you have evaluated them from film, or it was
well, it's more that they've been evaluated previously.
Yeah.
So we didn't run a separate experiment checking that people consider that as tense or scary.
You mentioned that you got about 50% rate of trained users taking the one course. How did you how did it work out if you didn't have any choices being made there? I mean, you mentioned that some people tried to remain neutral and not make anything happen. But I mean,
because they're trained before.
Sure.
They're trained in a separate room where they have to do something. If they don't manage to do anything, they don't get into the MRI scan.
If you ran it without a user, for instance, it would always take the negative course?
Yes.
Okay.
So what we're interested in detecting the subjects that want to change and can't change. And those who want to change but cannot change, they're trained outside the MRI scan, and if they cannot succeed in getting neurofeedback, we're not spending 40 minutes in the MRI scans with them.
They cost £400.
Hmm?
They cost £400 a go.
Yeah, well, plus our time and lots of...
I guess I was trying to establish what the control was. I mean, you know, and that's just running it without subjects, I guess, is it?
Control is there are different levels of control. First of all, the system cannot end positively without input, without subject.
Right.
And second, if it ends positively, well, you're checking that there is alpha input. There's alpha, the symmetry signal is above threshold.
I mean, I wonder how it might perform, for instance, if you put candidates in there without any training. So they're just watching it passively.
If they're watching it passively because alpha symmetry is not a passive measure. It's not like GSR. You have a tone, but what you're doing before the system is that you're thresholding for that baseline.
Right.
So people have a baseline alpha symmetry which depends on their mood. So you're testing them before, you're measuring that, and that becomes a baseline. So if you're putting them in the scan and they do nothing, the baseline doesn't change, and from your perspective, the input is 0. Because otherwise, you could not have an individual baseline, put very happy people in the system, and that would be interpreted as support, which is not. Because support needs to be above the baseline, and needs to be triggered and sustained for a certain amount of time.
I guess you could be seeing an effect which some people's brains have when they see somebody who is entirely devoid of colour, for instance. I mean, that's kind of, I mean, it's obviously it's unlikely, but
well, yes and no, because there are mechanisms that, again, it's not a measure. It's not a measure. It's an area of the brain which is about control. It's not an area of the brain which is about perception. So an area of the brain which is about control, if you're not controlling, it does nothing. It won't spontaneously flare up.
I have a couple of very layperson questions. One of which is, when you were talking about the debriefing session afterwards, you talked about what the subjects were thinking about. Did you ask them what they were feeling as well, or just what they were thinking about?
Well, there is a overall level of questioning, like, of course, did you enjoy it, or and why did you also enjoy the experiment and the film and the content? Yeah. Did you feel sympathy for the?
What did you? So it was kind of, did you feel sympathy, or what did you feel at this point? Because, like you said, you didn't tell them how to support. So I wondered if you asked the open question, what did you feel, as well as what did you think? The problem of what did you feel is not a very neurological question. Because you need to specify the question a bit, because otherwise you get categories that don't have a good mapping between the things that you are measuring. Okay, so you're saying that if they felt happy, they would have they'd have a higher baseline. Not happy. I mean. And it would be interpreted as support if there wasn't. That part of happy is an unconscious part. Yeah. It's more the general mood. Because what we're trying to do precisely is move away from the naive concepts of emotions to get to something which has a neural substrate. Yeah. So when I use the word happy, I meant that there are people that say that are more positive than others, and they have this baseline. So I'm still using layman terms in some presentation, but in the feedback we don't want to reintroduce all the naive, the full categories that we've worked so hard on getting rid of. No, because I just wondered, because I wasn't sure whether you'd get a similar kind of response from what do you think or what do you feel. We've asked something more specific. We've asked, what have you done? We've told. Right, okay. We've told, this is where we got questions such as, I cheered her up. Yeah. I was, chanting, cheering, and someone who said, well, I thought about my girlfriend. Yeah. And they are all different strategies. Right, okay, no, that was what I wondered, if because it was the thought, you said, what were they thinking? And the other thing is a more general question, which is about, did you notice any difference, or did you research any differences between the people who were able to do something or the people who weren't, or was that just not of an interest because you just you were only interested in the people who could.
The people who couldn't, we didn't pursue any further.
Yeah.
But I don't think, you know, this is really a filtering step. It says nothing if people cannot train in 5 minutes, because in the all accepted literature, the training is several days per week over several weeks.
Right.
So it would have really meant nothing to explore those. It says something about the good ones.
Yeah.
It says that, well, you know, they have this ability.
They pick this particular thing up quickly, but that's all it says.
They have this ability, but it doesn't mean that they cannot be trained to get this ability by you know, staying a bit longer.
Just helping on this, I've been on a presentation of the BCI, and basically, if you are quite good at, for example, meditation or concentration, you're usually actually quite good at the alpha signal.
That was an explanation that was given for me, because I mean, I had Zen training for a number of years, and I got. I'm not the best subject, but I'm the second best subject, and I found that normal, quite easy. But I used the same kind of mindset that I was using in meditation.
Okay.
That's what works.
Yes, to take that a bit further. So in terms of again, obviously, you've eliminated the long time training, so you're not going into the sort of Davidson type thing there. But then, are you?
We could, but we just didn't at this stage.
Sure, but with what you're doing there, isn't it? What? So, in terms of what you infer from this, in terms of what those people are doing, okay, so you've got a differential, but is that just you're measuring the fact that they can control a certain emotion and particularly a feedback? That's what I'm saying. Is this, because I've found this on various things where I've tried these out, and you learn a certain stage, and you can learn that quite quickly for some of them. But are you sort of effectively detecting people who are better at that? I accept that because you're doing this over an experiment. You're seeing the same feature and you're correlating it with the fMRI. I'm just sort of saying, though, is what does that represent? So as an example, supposing we wanted to say, great, we're going to use this actually to create games where you can feedback and do this. Would that actually work? So I said, is that what this could do? Or are you measuring something different from that?
I think the big effort in that work was to implement as thoroughly and professionally Davidson's experiment. To do something, so the problem of BCI is largely empirical, and it brings us back to, you know, all the Soviet research when they're trying to get the thoughts from the spies and the sci-fi behind the science. So we decided to stick extremely clinically to the Davidsonian protocol. And it only works, it could work for other things, but I'm not going to say it. I'm saying we wanted unification, an empathic model which is, you know, clinically consistent, which is neurologically, has a substrate both in the electrical signals and in the neural networks. An interactive narrative paradigm that can build upon that, and that's it, and nothing more. And I won't be claiming anything else because it was already a challenge. Now, of course, you know, you could imagine that, but alpha symmetry is control, is a certain type. So now we're working on other systems to, from the prefrontal cortex, to work on relaxation and post-traumatic stress disorder. But they're again within a very, you know, in games you don't have to be neurologically accurate. If someone finds that, you know, by cheating and blinking your eyes you're actually controlling things pretty well, well, you know, you can have a blockbuster. But there's like, you know, like in games you don't need to have the best AI to have the best game. It's a mix. Games are not subject to our constraint of, you know, conceptual unification and clarity of hypothesis. They get anything that works. So perhaps alpha symmetry could be used in games, but I only know about alpha symmetry in the context of controlling empathy in that type of filmic responses.
Is there actually any hope from what you heard from the neuroscientists that you can detect involuntary empathy? So not one that is actually consciously controlled by the prefrontal cortex, but actually happens by what some psychologists call the system 2, which is the direct response.
You could, you'll have to look into the MRI signals directly instead of using the MRI signal for validation. The problem, that's in our plans, but the problem is that you need to re-engineer the system because the best, you need some cleansing with the fMRI data. So real time, the best real time is 10-12 seconds. So it's completely different sampling rate than EEG. You will need to re-engineer the entire system. But of course, that using the real fMRI signal as BCI input is something that it's lots of people are talking about it. It's a hot topic.
And because, or could it be that one could read already from the prefrontal alpha reaction that there is some involuntary emotion? It seemed that when you showed the last video, when the blood started to splurt, I saw actually noticed on the brain everything went blue, which is strange, which you would normally expect maybe everything would light up with red.
But but it can also be processing delay or starting of a, these things really need to be, we have to rely on the neuroscientists for interpretation. If we start to apply our own, cybernetical view, like the brain is any other machine, like it's a motherboard, and we see lights going on and off, we should be very cautious, because if you read Gann's paper, there are multiple hypotheses, that there are still things that are contradicting each other, and yet is produced results. So I'm trying to be as cautious as I can, insisting really on the validity of this experiment is within one very precise paradigm, and I'm not claiming that it can be extended. Until my next talk, when I would have extended.
The work you've been doing there, you've been sort of like doing the whole spectrum from GSR to the whole fMRI scan.
Mm-hmm.
So clearly, I guess there is a big decision to be made between accuracy and maybe what you can get in real time, I guess, I suppose. So how will that whole experience sort of inform your view about using different type of technologies for sort of real time?
So you have accuracy, but accuracy is more correlation. For instance, GSR, everybody says GSR equals arousal. In reality, correlation is 80%, which is much better than heart rate, which is 65%, but it's still not very good. In the case of alpha symmetry, you have all the previous literature, so you're going to something which tends to be a bit more specific. In the case of using fMRI data, that's not going to be real time for the near future, but it gives you quite precise localization. There are things we've not done which could be done, ERPs plus fMRI. Lots of combinations, but the difficulty is that every time you're introducing, these measurements are very often taken in isolation. We get very excited as computer scientists, and we forget there have been 200 papers, on GSR, and again, with 80% of papers being wrong, you can very easily get inspired by the wrong paper. I think that at the moment I'll stick to EEG, and I'll stick to EEG with professional equipment.
Yeah.
Although I had, as a subject, a very pleasant experience using the open vibe system with the motive, but with one electrode, what you can infer and extrapolate is a bit limited. And I also think that EEG is only working because the Davidsonian paradigm is fairly sophisticated. Otherwise, it needs, if you know the work of Paul Sachda at Columbia, is working on the implicit perception of satellite images. So it is detecting the implicit recognition of, well, essentially targets in a satellite image by monitoring the EEG, but by doing a level of processing of the EEG signal, which is absolutely phenomenal. I think this is where the trade-off is. It's to get a signal whose semantics you can trust, and without having to over-analyze and interpret it. And there are not that many things as the alpha symmetry. If you want to find more about today's presentation, you have one paper published at Intelligent User Interfaces in 2012, and this year's paper at ISHCAI.